Hi, everybody. Scott Spires here from Counseling Supervision Services. This is my first program, and I'd like to welcome my very first guest, James Crouch.
It's great to be here, Scott.
I think one of the storms that people run into that you and I have experience with are DWIs.
Oh yeah, I've run through that rainstorm more times than I would want to with clients.
As the offender or the counselor or the lawyer, which one?
No, I was lucky. Probably it could have been the former, but definitely the latter. I've been lucky in my earlier years in life. I probably broke the law in that area more than I wish to admit, and just was never caught.
Yeah.
But yeah, as a criminal defense attorney, when I was practicing law, I had the honor and privilege to represent thousands of people charged with driving while impaired.
Right, and that's one of the things I want to talk about. Until recently, I worked at a DWI facility, and I kept seeing the same things over and over again, right? I'd get these totally law-abiding people in every aspect of their lives, and they end up making one decision, and they get a DWI. And I always heard, oh my God, I wish I had known about this before I even got behind the wheel. So have you ever had that happen?
Oh yeah, I mean, in representing people, it's like you said, in our substance abuse work in our field there, we see a lot of these people who need assessments for the DWI, and they are law-abiding people, and people used to ask me at parties and stuff, James, how can you represent these criminals, for driving while impaired? And I'm like, these people are not criminals. They're like you and me. That's what alcohol does to people. It causes the brain to not function the way it normally does, and they make an isolated mistaken judgment because they're impaired. It's nothing more, nothing less than that. It doesn't mean they have a use disorder. It doesn't mean they have a drinking problem. It just means that they made the wrong decision after they had too much to drink legally. A lot of them feel fine. A lot of them actually probably still have their mental or physical faculties. But again, we have a statute in North Carolina that says if you have a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08 or more, regardless of whether you're walking fine or talking fine or are able to do the test or you're driving fine, if you blow a 0.08 or more or have a blood test result that comes back at a 0.08 or more, that the presumption is you're guilty of driving while impaired.
That reminds me, is it possible to get a DWI with a blood alcohol content below 0.08?
Absolutely. Yes. There have been many people every year in Wake County and in North Carolina across the state will get convicted with a blood alcohol concentration of alcohol of less than 0.08. It's what we call a dirty DWI. You may only blow a 0.06 or a 0.07, but there will be a videotape most of the time of how you're walking and talking. And I've seen some people, and we both know about tolerance. We know some people who lack any tolerance or who have very low tolerance. They will exhibit a lot of behaviors below a 0.08 that you would normally see at either a 0.10 or a 0.11 or a 0.12. They just don't handle their alcohol very well.
I know, and I've had cases where somebody blew a 0.24. Somewhere in there, but they absolutely passed the field sobriety test because they have a high tolerance, and it's a little sneak peek into the future of things I like to talk about. But usually we know a person has a real problem with alcohol when we see them without the alcohol in the system. That while they're under the influence, they're actually fine. But that strays a little bit out of what we wanted to talk about today, but alcohol is a funny thing. Plus, I believe you can be convicted DWI if you're on medication.
Yes, in North Carolina, you can be charged and convicted of driving while impaired with only prescription medications in your system if those medications appreciably impair you. And most of the prescribed medications do have they're in our controlled substances list in our general statutes. And so if they are a controlled substance and you are impaired by them, they do cause noticeable impairment. You can be convicted of a DWI with no alcohol in your system, just prescription medication. And even if it's the prescribed amount that you've taken, unfortunately.
Right, there are the warning labels on the medication. Do not drive after taking, etc. And that can and will be used against you in a court of law in many circumstances.
It's some people are just they come to me, and when I was practicing, they say, "Look, I've been taking this medication for years, and yeah, it does make me feel a little lightheaded. It makes me feel loopy at times, but I had no idea that." If I took I can see if I was taking, double what I was prescribed or, abusing it, but I was only taking the therapeutic amount. And I'm like, the law doesn't account for that. It only says if it impairs you, it's a public safety statute. And so even if you take the right amount, if it impairs you appreciably and noticeably, the goal is you can't take something that's going to cause you to not be able to safely operate a motor vehicle. And so...
Right, and I believe that technically, it's not driving while intoxicated, it's driving while impaired.
Yes, it's been driving while impaired for many, many years. It used to be called DUI in North Carolina. It was driving under the influence, but they changed that acronym many, many years ago to DWI. It's been that way for, so far long back that I can't remember.
Yeah, I think when I first came into the field, which was 2006, it had recently changed right around that point.
Yeah, it's funny how clients used to, they would call when I was practicing law, and now that when I'm doing my substance abuse work, and they'll call me, and one of the initial questions I'll say is, "Are you calling me?" Because I get a lot of referrals from other lawyers for driving while impaired assessments to do substance abuse assessments for them. And I go, "Did you receive a DWI? Is that why you're calling me?" And they'll go, No, I didn't get a DWI. I got a DUI. And I don't know where they get that term. And I don't know why they think there is a difference, but there are many people, for whatever reason, that feel like there's a difference between the two, and they're really the same thing. It's the same thing, but they're called by a different name now. So,
when I was doing research for the blog post that kind of started this thing, I spent a lot of time on YouTube watching YouTube videos about DWI. Some of the stuff that I saw on there was absolutely horrifying. One example, and I probably won't put a clip in because I don't want to get sued, but it was a guy in another state. He's a lawyer. He's literally doing his video while he's driving. So he has the phone on his dashboard, and you can see him. He's like, "Ooh, that was a close one." Anyway, here in this state, I'm like, oh my God, there are some people you do not want to go to for DWI advice or legal advice. Number one, if someone is literally driving impaired while they're telling you how to handle a charge of driving while impaired.
Yeah.
And clarify, I believe texting does, or talking on the phone. Is that a separate charge or a similar charge? How does that work?
Well, for a long time, texting while driving was not any type of violation of the law. But then after enough people were hurt and or killed, unfortunately, and unfortunately the legislature has a tendency to be reactive instead of proactive when it comes to these types of things. It is still only an infraction for the first offense if you're convicted of texting while driving, and no insurance points. But after a first offense, a second offense, then it becomes like a moving violation, and you can receive insurance points. It's interesting that you raised the texting while driving. I've been on the road behind many people, and it looks like I'll look at my wife and say, either that person has had a lot to drink and they're impaired, or they're on their phone. And we were driving down the road not long ago, and I said, I got to get away from this car because this person, something's going on. So I go around them, and as soon as I look over to my right, they literally have their feet up on the dash with their seat all the way back, and they have one of those huge, it's like an iPad, but it looked like an oversized phone, and they were watching TV. And it mimics everything that a drunk driver does. They speed up, they slow down, they drift to the left, they drift to the right. Sometimes they cross the center line. It's all the things that a police officer would look for when they're trying to gather reasonable suspicion to stop you. And a lot of people say that the laws for texting while driving, they think that there should be a law that if the actual texting is witnessed and the driving is not safe, that it should be treated like a DWI. It's an interesting thought. It's an interesting, I don't know, it's pretty novel. But you know what? It's hard to argue against it because I think people probably, and I probably shouldn't say this in the field that I'm in, but people who are texting and driving and operating or watching TV or whatever they're doing on their devices, their driving is a lot of times worse than someone who is above the legal limit. Many times it's worse.
I'd have to agree with you there. So part of when I was doing the research, because I come across that, I don't think people understand how much a DWI can cost in most cases. So I'm going to put you on the spot off the top of your head. How much do you think the typical DWI, let's say first offense, 0.10, BAC, clearly they were impaired. How much is, at the end of the day, when everything's all said and done, what do you think the average cost for that is?
$10,000 to $15,000.
I'd like to repeat that. The first time DWI is going to cost a person between $10,000 and $15,000. And if you don't mind, share a little bit, where does that expense come from?
Well, if you hire a lawyer to defend you, which you should always do, and even if you can't afford a lawyer, you should opt to get a court-appointed attorney, because the consequences of a DWI, if you're convicted, they carry on much longer than the day you're convicted. There's many things that you have to comply with to get your license back eventually. But when you start adding up the cost, the initial cost, of course, is, if you have to bond out of jail, usually if it's a first offense, you don't have to post a bond, but you could, if you have a magistrate who's had a bad night, he could give you a $500 bond or something like that. You may have to pay $500 or 15% of $500 to get out of jail. That starts the cost. Then you pay another $100 to get your driving privilege when you initially get suspended for 30 days. You hire a lawyer. The average cost of a competent DWI attorney, if you're going to hire one in Wake County, the going rate is probably around $3,500.
Okay.
So now we're up to around $4,000. You go to court. We're not even counting any days missed to go to court over the period of time it's pending, which is an entirely different issue and cost that you really don't realize that you're having, because you just have to go to court for so long that it becomes, some people have to take vacation at some point or take vacation days. And so then at the end, if you're convicted, you're looking at court cost, fines, and community service fees that are probably between $700 and $1,000 at that point. You have substance abuse assessment for $100, and then, depending on what treatment is recommended, your classes could range anywhere from $185 up to probably $1,000, depending on what the recommended treatment is and depending where you go to get it. Everybody charges different prices.
Oh, yeah. I can say that in the easiest cases where the person pays $185, if I remember right, that's if it's their first offense and the blood alcohol level is below 0.15.
Correct.
And that they haven't been involved in another accident. There's no other, it's just a simple DWI. So that's $185. But if in the assessment you've had more than one DWI, you actually have a substance use disorder, they can give you up to 90 hours of substance abuse treatment. And if it's group, that's going to be at $30 a pop.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
at the most extreme case, they can end up spending $2,700.
That
Does it?
is true. For 90 hours, they could. Yeah.
I believe they can use insurance.
Yeah, I had a client one time who used his insurance to do his substance abuse treatment after his conviction. And he later, a couple years later, he started a family and had some kids and realized he wanted some life insurance and he got denied.
So the consequences of the DWI, they can kind of hang with you for years and years. We haven't even addressed car insurance.
That's the biggie. And so generally speaking, your insurance will go up 400% for 3 years. From the conviction date for the next 3 years, you'll pay a 400% surcharge on your premium that you were paying before the DWI. So if you were paying $1,000 for insurance a year, you'll now be paying somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 a year.
And that one hurts.
That's the big one. That's the one that really jacks up. It's really, you don't see that cost until probably the DWI goes on for a year. The premium doesn't hit until the conviction, the next cycle rolls around. And so if your insurance company runs your record every 6 months or every quarter or once a year or however they do it to look to see what your experience period is to keep your rates the same or raise them up, they see that DWI, say 6 months after your conviction. So now you're probably 18 to 24 months past the day you were charged with the DWI, and you're getting the costs are going to just dramatically increase for another 3 years, and you're already almost 2 years into this thing.
Yeah. So at that point, the DWI could be costing right around $20,000.
Oh yeah, I'm talking, when I say 10,000, that's the very bottom end. If you're going to drive a junker and you're only going to carry liability insurance and you don't have anybody else in the family to insure, and you go with a court-appointed lawyer or no lawyer at all, that's the only way it's going to hover around 10,000. It's always going to be closer to 15 and sometimes 20.
And that's in the easiest case. Now, when I was watching the YouTube videos, I saw a really disturbing trend that I'd like to get away from today, where they go to the most extreme and dramatic case in talking about DWIs. I'd like to focus, if you don't mind, a little bit on the people who they have a 0.08 to a 0.14, right? Mm-hmm. They've never had a DWI, and they have absolutely no diagnosable condition, right?
Right.
What percentage of your clients so far do you think fall into that category?
I would say 70%.
Yeah,
probably.
I would say that. So I did DWI starting in 2006 in Onslow County, and then last year I was doing DWI assessments here in Wake. 70% of the people that I saw had no diagnosable substance use disorder. So one of the big questions, and I'd like to kind of devote the rest of this session, our time together, can we talk to those people for a couple minutes?
Sure. Absolutely.
What are some ways that you've come across where if your client knew this before they got into the vehicle, do you know of any strategies that can help people prevent what is the most preventable ticket I've ever heard of?
That gets the reason, I do a class on the the reasons why people get DWIs.
Okay.
And you know, when I was practicing law, you get a good idea about why people get them from the horse themselves. So, you know, one of the questions I would say is, well, why did you make the decision to drive after drinking? And Scott, most of them, I would say the people that you see that have no criminal record, they blow between a .08 and a .14, that kind of, you know, that, I don't want to call it a gray area for purposes of the law. When you blow in this county, in the jurisdiction I live in, if you blow a .09, a 10, 11, 12, 13, or 14, 9's about like a 14 in terms of whether you're going to be found guilty or not. If they can prove you were driving the car and they have probable cause to arrest you, most judges, in my personal experience, would find a .09 guilty, just as easy as finding a .14 guilty.
Right.
But what most of these people say who have that blood alcohol concentration is, I really thought I was okay to drive. I felt fine. I stopped drinking for a little while. I drank a lot of water. I think a lot of these people, they read and hear things like, if I drink a lot of water after I drink alcohol, or if I eat something after I drink alcohol, or if I drink one drink per hour and I only drink beer, then I should be okay. And so what happens is and they actually probably in their mind feel like they are okay to drive, because what they do, like we all do as human beings, they have probably driven a car in far worse condition in terms of how much alcohol they've had and how impaired they are. And they remember, oh, I drove that night. I shouldn't have driven that night, but I got home. Compared to that night, I'm good tonight. I can get home and I'm only a mile away. That's also another big one. I'm only a mile away from home. I think I'm good enough. Somehow that being only a mile away instead of 4 miles away, even if you're legally impaired in both situations, just being closer to home makes it okay to drive versus not okay to drive.
In fact, I'd say I don't want to put a percentage, but a lot of my clients got pulled over within 1 mile of their home.
Oh, usually I've had many clients who have driven across the county or 2 counties,
right,
and they're like, James, can you believe it? As I was getting ready to turn into my driveway, the blue lights came on.
Yeah. I think a lot of times with those, because that they're in a familiar neighborhood, they'll do a California roll through a stop sign. I'd say that's easily in the top 10.
Oh, yeah.
A few things that I wish people would keep in mind is, one, there is a difference between a shot of alcohol, which 160-pound male, that would give them about a .02, .03 BAC. There's a world of difference between that shot and what's known as a bar shot in a bar. Would you agree with that?
I don't think there are many 1 ounce or 1.5 ounce pours of shots in our establishments that serve alcohol to their patrons.
Yeah,
I mean,
I've had this talk many times. If your bartender is pouring it like Tom Cruise in that movie, the chances of that being a precisely measured shot are minuscule. The other problem that I wish people had known is it takes roughly 10 to 15 minutes for you to feel the effect of the alcohol. Because and that's where the empty stomach and the water, it can slow the absorption if you eat, but you're still going to get the BAC. It just takes you longer to get there. And
correct.
I've had a lot of cases where they'll have 3 drinks, figure they're okay because it's been 2 or 3 hours. They down the last shot or the last beer. They feel totally fine when they get into the car. But 15 minutes later when they're pulled over, that's when the alcohol hits their system.
Yeah. The other thing that I would like clients to know or wish they knew is especially the differences in how men and women metabolize and eliminate alcohol. I can't tell you the number of small women, roughly a woman who's 100 pounds, who's 5'1" or 4'11" or 5'2", and there's a lot of women that size, a petite woman. Literally, I've seen women, and I've had the bar receipts, I've had the dinner receipts. Literally, 2.5 glasses of wine over 3 hours, and they blow a .09 or a .10. Granted, some of those were on an empty stomach, and there wasn't a lot of time after the last drink before they got in the car and drove, so there was no time for it to really start, the elimination to start occurring. But if you are a small woman, anywhere from 90 to 110 pounds, and you have not eaten or you're not properly hydrated, I think that it's possible drinking wine or spirits to get to a .08 after 2 drinks.
Oh, easily, if not a little bit more.
Right.
And again, when we talk clinically about a serving of wine, it's 4 ounces.
Right.
Very few establishments that I've ever been to actually do a 4-ounce pour, and the glass itself is usually at least a 6-ounce glass. Yeah. So be careful when you're out. I've got 3 basic suggestions for people to help them avoid the DWI. First, wait a minimum of a half hour after your last drink. 2, there are apps you can get on your phone where you can actually keep count. You put in your age, your gender, your body weight, and you can actually calculate what your blood alcohol level is going to be. And the third one is you can get breathalyzers. I believe they sell them in drugstores. Nobody ever thinks of this, but there are ways to keep track of your drinking. Make sure that your one drink isn't a Long Island iced tea. I think another thing people aren't aware of, there's a difference in blood alcohol content between Budweiser and an IPA.
Oh, yeah.
Where it may actually be twice the alcohol content. So stay aware.
Absolutely. I mean, the word drink gets thrown around. There's a joke from a judge one time who always said that whenever he was sitting in a trial and the police officer asked the defendant on the roadside who was being investigated for driving while impaired, one of the initial questions is, "Sir, ma'am, I smell alcohol. Have you been drinking tonight?" And most people will say, "Well, yeah, I have." And then you get the proverbial, "Well, how many have you had, sir?" "A couple." And then the police officer's like, "A couple?" He's like, "Yeah, well, what do you mean by a couple?" And sometimes they'll say, "Well, I don't know, just a couple." Or sometimes they'll say, 2, maybe 3. There was a judge who had an unwritten rule, which was wrong, and he shouldn't have done it, but he did. He said, I would usually, when someone said a couple, I would just triple it. Right off the bat. Now, that's inappropriate. It's improper. But, in a lot of ways, when someone thinks they do have a couple of drinks, they have had more than 2 drinks, because it's what you've been talking about, the standard pours in terms of what is a drink for purposes of BAC, for wine, for spirits, and so that's usually not what you're getting when you go out and drink. When you have 2 drinks, you're probably really having maybe 3 drinks, or you're having 3.5 drinks, sometimes 4 drinks, depending on how generous the bartender is with his alcohol.
Agreed. So, a lot of bars can be pretty generous. Okay, I think we're back. So what are the reasons why someone should always have an attorney represent them, regardless of what they blew?
Because by hiring an attorney, you're making sure that you, at a minimum, are going to get what you are constitutionally entitled to as a citizen of this country. and that is due process, an opportunity to be heard, and if you plead guilty, whether you plead guilty or whether you have a trial and contest the charge against you, by having a lawyer, you're making sure that you have the process work for you as it should. Now, whatever happens, whether you're exonerated, acquitted, found guilty, it gives you the peace of mind of knowing, okay, I got my day in court, I had a competent lawyer, I was afforded what I'm entitled to. I'm not entitled necessarily, if I hire a lawyer, to get out of it. I tell people all the time, you don't hire a lawyer to get out of anything. You hire a lawyer to make sure that you don't get screwed unfairly. And that means sometimes people don't get a lawyer. I'll be sitting in court. I used to sit in court and see somebody representing themselves. And I'm like, if I was sitting in that chair beside them, they would not be convicted of this.
Right.
Because they don't know when to object. They don't know what questions to ask. And they are going to be convicted of something that the government doesn't have the evidence to convict them of. But because they didn't get a lawyer, they're going to be convicted when they shouldn't be. And that happens. That really does happen.
Add to that.
I think that's just a good rule. No more than 2 drinks is a good solid rule, because I think that for most people, I always say, look, if you can feel the effects of the alcohol, in terms of, I always ask people, after how many drinks can you tell you've been drinking?
Right.
And what I mean by that is, when you go from a condition of pure sobriety, being completely sober, to that feeling of where you don't feel like you're the way you were before you took that first drink, it's probably a good idea at that point to say, okay, I probably shouldn't take a chance right now. And that's usually for most people after 2 drinks, when they feel the first effects of the alcohol.
Would absolutely agree. So it's not driving while drunk, it's driving while impaired. And even though you feel like you're fine, and there's science behind this, right? Your reaction time is diminished. A lot of people had a fender bender, so they just didn't stop on time. So be careful. Limit it to 2 drinks or less. Wait at least a half hour. And if really necessary, make sure you have a designated driver who, by definition, should not be drinking.
Absolutely. Or an Uber account.
In the Uber accounts, that $40 drive home might save you how much again?
Oh yeah, I think we touched upon that at the beginning. I think I would rather pay $40 both ways than $15,000 or $20,000 over the next 2 or 3 years. Absolutely.
Couldn't agree more. And again, just to emphasize, DWI, it's expensive. Whether you have a substance use disorder or not, it's separate. It doesn't mean you have a drinking problem, except you drank. Now you have a pretty big problem. So folks, please think before you drive and take care of yourselves out there. James, thank you so much for your time. It's always good to talk to you.
Sure, Scott, I enjoyed it. Look forward to doing it again soon.
So if anybody listening or watching is in North Carolina and they've had a DWI, how do they get in touch with a fine man like yourself?
Well, now I'm pretty much exclusively doing assessments for people who are charged with and or convicted of driving while impaired. And so if you do pick up a DWI charge and your lawyer tells you that you need to get a substance abuse assessment, I'm probably one of many people in the state, but I'm one that you could give a call to. My business is called James Crouch Counseling, and my number is 910-348-4633. You can text that number. You can call that number. I usually will pick up if I'm not working with a client, but if you do have a DWI and you're in need of an assessment or treatment to comply with the law and either get yourself a driving privilege or to get your license back, I'd be happy to help you.
Okay, and I'll make sure we'll have the link in the subscription. Folks, if you got anything from this, please give us a like and hit that subscribe button. And until next time, buddy, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Scott.